Hi there. So recently I've been reading this book called Thinking in SwiftUI from Chris Idov and Florian Kugler. These authors are well known in the Swift community and I can highly recommend you their books. I also added an Amazon affiliate link for that particular SwiftUI book that you can use to support the authors, but also this channel as well. So in one of the chapters they showed an interesting way on how you can use SwiftUI to perform network requests and update your SwiftUI views pretty efficiently. And I would like to share a slightly modified version of that implementation that you can use in your projects as well. So what we're going to build is basically something that takes a JSON, and the URL for this you will find in the description. And this JSON response basically contains multiple objects, and in each of these you will get information about the author, some width and height information, and a download URL for an image. So we will take this information, create a list with all of these authors, and when we select one of these authors, the image gets loaded. You can see this small loading indicator, and as soon as the loading is done, you will also see the image that is directly downloaded from that particular download URL. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Alright, now open up Xcode, create a new project, and choose app. For you, it could be also this called single view app, but since I'm using the latest beta version, it got renamed to app. So press next, give it a name. I will just call it networking. And as always, make sure the interface is set to SwiftUI and the language to Swift. Continue by pressing next and save it somewhere you like. All right, once you're in Xcode, make sure that you select the iPhone 11 as your simulator. And try to get the automatic preview running. If it doesn't run, don't worry, you can also just run it on the simulator and see the changes as you follow along with this tutorial. Let's also zoom out a bit. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is look at the JSON and create a model for these objects. So let's see what we need. We need an ID, we need an author. The ID is a string. The author is also a string, and these can be represented with an integer. And the URL, you can actually directly parse them as a URL. Similarly, you can also do it for the download URL. So let's get started. I will create a struct for this called photo. And we have to make sure that it's codable so we can pass it to the JSON decoder. And it also has to be identifiable because we're getting an array of these. To iterate through them in a for each loop, we have to make sure that it's also identifiable. So we saw in the JSON that we need an ID, and the ID was of type string. The author was also representable by a string. The width and height can be represented with an integer. And then we also have some URL. So we have the regular URL and the download URL. And they are of type URL. So a common mistake what people do is they would rename these or use instead of this bar, they would use something like camel case. And then you would obviously not be able to parse it and get some error. So make sure it is just like in the JSON to avoid any mistakes. Next, we are going to create our observable object. As always, make sure you create these in separate files. So this should be in a group called model, and this should be in some group called vModel. So I will create a final class called remote. And we are going to make this one generic so we can not only load photos, but really any type of data. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to use this generic letter A. And it's going to be of type observable object, like so. Now in here, I'm going to create a published variable called result that will keep track of the data that has been already loaded. And we have to make sure it's published, so whenever it changes, the vModel can also react to the changes as well. So what we will have is something of type result, A result is a value that represents either a success or failure. And this is super handy here because obviously the loading can fail, and if it fails, we want to return error instead of the actual result. So the result takes the type for the success case, which is our generic type. And for the failing case, we will have some kind of error that we will implement later. Now this is going to be an optional, and initially when nothing is loaded, it's nil. Now, since this result is of type result, whenever you access the type, you have to make some switch statement on this result. So you will have a success and failure case that you have to deal with. And to make our lives easier, I will create a computed property that will directly unwrap it for us in case it's successful or otherwise be no. So the way we are going to do it is we're going to declare a variable called value, and it's going to be of type, our generic type, and it will return the result by using get. And as you can see, it returns the success value as a throwing expression. So since it throws, we have to also make sure that we add the try key in here. Next, we need a property to keep track of the URL. And lastly, we will create a transform function that is super handy. We can use it later on to easily access the data in a completion handler. Now, it sounds a bit complicated, but you will see it once we're done with this. So let me first implement it. So this will be called transform, and it's basically a function that takes a data and returns our generic type, which can be optional, obviously. Now, we need an initializer because these two do not have initial values, right? So let's create an initializer. All right, now the error should be disappearing. So the last thing we need in here is a load function that basically loads our data, tries to decode it into a particular type, and then basically fills this result with the corresponding result that we get from the loaded data. Now for this, I will create a function called load. All right, so inside of this load function, we are going to create an URL session like so, and we are going to use the shared instance of it. And we will make sure that we use the data test that takes in URL and a completion handler. So the URL is basically the one that we are getting when this whole thing is initialized. And the completion handler is going to give us some data and some response and error that we do not care about now. Now inside of this closure, we will try to transform our data using this transform function and then fill the result with data we're getting. But since every time we're changing this result, it is published and the UI will also change, we have to make sure that this happens in the main queue. And the way we're going to do that is by simply saying dispatch queue.main.asynchronous, and inside we can actually modify the result as well. So let's first check if we have some data like so. And some value. So here we are going to use the transform function that basically takes the data, right? It takes the data and tries to return the generic type. So in our case, in this instance, it would be the photo. Now for value exists, what we can do is we can modify the result as follows. We can simply say self.result is equal to the success. And in the success case, we can also pass the type, right? So we will simply pass our value in here, like so. However, if it was not successful and we do not have data, then we are going to set the result to the failure case. And here we should pass an error. And for now, I will just create a simple struct for that, like so. And we will simply use this in here, like so. Now, one common mistake that is always done when people use the data task is they forget to call the resume on it. So make sure that you do not forget it. All right, this is all we need for our view model. And now let's take advantage of this view model inside of our content view. So in here, we will create an observed object like so. And we will simply call it items, and it will be remote, which should take an URL and a transform function. So the URL we will simply create in here like so. And we will pass it the string representation. And you can find this URL in the description and just copy and paste it in here. Now, this transform function is interesting. So this basically describes how we are going to transform the data that we are getting to the corresponding type that we are interested in this case, the photos. So the way we're going to do it is by simply passing it the JSON decoder. So we will say try JSON decoder, and then we use this instant to decode a specific type, which is decodable, which is going to be our photo. And we will pass it in here. But if you take a closer look at the JSON, we're not really getting the photo, but we are actually getting an array of photos. So you should write it like this, and make sure you write .self because we are talking about the type. And in here we can use this nice and handy dollar notation to basically access the data that we are decoding. Now, this URL can be force unwrapped because we know that this string exists because we just hard-coded it in here. All right, now let's try to create this navigation view with the list of all authors. And to do that, we go into the body, we remove the default code, and we will replace it with a navigation view. And inside of this navigation view, we have to distinguish between two cases. The case where we do not have any data yet, maybe because the data is still loading, and the case where the data is already loaded. So let's do that in here with an if condition. So if the items.value is equal to nil, we're simply going to use a progress view like so. And if that's not the case, and we do have some values, then we will create our list. And inside of this list, we will have a for each. And it will iterate over items.value. Now in this case, we can force unwrap it because we are pretty sure that it's not nil in the else case. And we can simply access the photo in here like so. Now let's create a row or a navigation link for each of these authors. And to do that, we will do navigation link that takes the destination and the label. Now the destination we will create later on, so I will just keep it like that. The label is going to be our author's name, so we will simply replace this by saying photo.author. Now let's also give it a navigation title, like so. And I will simply call this one authors. Now let's try to run this app. You can see the loading indicator, which basically means the data is being loaded. However, the rows are not appearing, and that is because we never really called this load function right. Now there are many ways to solve this problem, but a common approach that is used quite often is to simply say, all right, when the progress view is initially loaded, that's where we want to actually load the entries. So we can say on appear, like so, and in here we can say items.load. Now let's try and run again. As you can see, now the entries appear. And as of now, if you click in any of these entries, you will always see destination because we haven't really created an image view yet. So let's create this separate view for that image. I will call this view photo view. It's going to be of type view. Now inside of here, we're going to work similarly as we did with the content view. We will have an observed object, and it's going to have an image of type remote. But since this is generic, we can now say UI images, like so. Now, obviously we do not conform yet because we didn't implement the body yet. So let's do that quickly in here. And for now, I will just return some text. We will get back to this. Let's also create an initializer. So basically what will happen is inside here where we have the destination, we are going to pass the photo URL such that the photo view can start loading that image using this remote class. And to do that, we have to pass the URL through the initializer, and we will do it like so. And then we will basically initialize this image with this loaded data, like so. So we will use the URL, and the transform function basically tries to create an UI image with some data that it retrieves. And here we can easily use the $0 symbol to access the current data. All right, now all we have to do now is simply create the photo view, but here we also want to show a progress view while the data is loading. So let's start by using a group. And inside of this group, we will have our if condition, because you can't just have an if condition in the body because then Xcode will complain. So we will say image.value. If that is nil, then the data is not loaded, and we just simply show our progress view like so. And similarly to the content view, we will also load the data in the on appear. So we will say, actually we can do it in one line, like so. We can say image.load data or load, and then for the case where the image could be loaded, so image exists, we can simply create our image view that takes an UI image, and here we will pass our image.value. Now similarly to the content view, we can also assume that this is not nil. So we can force unwrap it here as well, and that will get rid of the error. And we will also apply some modifiers to the image so it doesn't look weird. So we will say it's resizable, and we will set an aspect ratio with the content mode fit. And lastly, let's also give it a navigation title. Now simply say photo. Now let's try and run this. So here we have our list, and if we select one of these, oh, we forgot one more thing. Obviously we have to call this photo view. We haven't done this yet, so we will do that in here. We will replace this text with photo. Sorry, it should be photo view, right? And it will take the URL, and the URL is going to be the photo.download URL. Let's run again and see if that fixes our problem. So once again, the list of the authors, and if we select one of these, the image is loading, and here it is. Nice. So as I mentioned earlier in this tutorial, this remote class is super useful. You can also use it in your own projects, and it doesn't really matter what type of data you're loading, right? We were able to load this photo, but we were also able to load data from a URL as well. I hope this tutorial was helpful. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you get notified when new content arrives, and I will see you in the next tutorial.